It began with a laugh. Not the kind that lightens a room, not the kind shared between friends, but a sharp, dismissive chuckle that sliced through the chamber like broken glass. Tommy Tuberville leaned back in his chair, shoulders loose, lips curling into a smirk that seemed rehearsed from years of belittling others. As Representative Jasmine Crockett spoke, laying out her case with precision and calm, the senator's laughter wasn't just aimed at her words, it was aimed at her dignity. The camera caught it, the microphones picked it up, and in that instant, every person watching could feel it. The sneer of power mocking principle. Arrogance mocking sacrifice. A few seats away, aides shifted uncomfortably. One senator lowered his eyes. The sound wasn't loud, but it echoed because everyone in that chamber knew what it meant. Tuberville wasn't just laughing at Crockett. He was laughing at what she represented. A young black woman, daughter of a veteran, standing in a place that had never been designed for her. His chuckle was the oldest sound in American politics, the voice of entitlement mocking the audacity of new power. Crockett didn't flinch. Her voice didn't rise. She carried herself with the same composure her father once carried in a jungle half a world away. But beneath that calm, the moment carried a weight the senator never anticipated. He thought he was ridiculing her. In truth, he was ridiculing every soldier who had fought, bled, and written home from battlefields that most politicians only mention on holidays. The chamber grew tighter, the silence around his laughter louder than the sound itself. Viewers at home paused, leaning closer to their screens. On Twitter, clips began to circulate within minutes. Tuberville smirking, Crockett holding her ground. But those watching live could sense something more, something shifting. Because Crockett wasn't just armed with statistics or talking points. In her folder, pressed between the sheets of policy briefings and notes, she carried a weapon far sharper than any retort, far more enduring than any debate quip. And no one in that chamber could have predicted what Crockett had hidden in her folder, a single letter that would silence the laughter. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to step back and see the stage it was set upon. This wasn't just another exchange in a crowded chamber. This was a collision of values, a confrontation that reached into the marrow of American identity. The policy being discussed, funding, recognition, respect for those who had served, was important. But beneath the surface, it wasn't numbers on a page or clauses in a bill that drew the nation's attention. It was something far deeper. It was about whether sacrifice would still mean something in a country that often treats service as a talking point instead of a living legacy. For months, Tuberville had built a reputation for brushing off critics, digging in when challenged, and laughing when called out. To his supporters, it looked like toughness. To his detractors, it was arrogance, masking insecurity. But here, in this moment, his dismissive laugh wasn't just a personal quirk. It struck against the grain of a culture that still reveres the flag-draped coffin, the folded triangle of cloth handed to a grieving spouse, the whispered prayers of soldiers riding home under fire. Jasmine Crockett knew this. She wasn't only a lawmaker, she was the daughter of a man who had gone to war, carried America's weight on his back, and written his family letters that spoke not of politics, but of survival. And that day, she wasn't simply speaking for herself. She was carrying every story of every soldier who had been told their sacrifice was invisible. The stakes were higher than they appeared. Tuberville thought it was just banter, just another chamber squabble. But outside those marble walls, millions of Americans were listening. Immigrant families whose sons had signed up for a chance to prove their belonging. Black veterans who had returned home from war, only to be denied the rights they had fought for overseas. Children of service members who grew up knowing their parents' body might never return home. Tuberville's laugh wasn't only directed at Crockett. To those watching, it was pointed at them too. That's why the tension in the air felt electric. This was no longer about two politicians trading blows. It was about whether arrogance would be allowed to trample dignity unchecked. And Crockett.com, and unshaken, began hinting that her response would not be hers alone. She spoke with a weight that made the chamber lean forward, as if she carried something beyond the usual rhythm of debate. There was a story resting in her folder, a voice from the past waiting to be unleashed. Her words set the stage, but her eyes carried the promise of something more. She reminded the chamber that service wasn't an abstract concept, that sacrifice wasn't a prop for speeches. And then, almost casually, she hinted that the answer to Tuberville's smirk would not come from her lips at all. It would come from someone who had lived it, someone who had marched through mud and jungle while bullets cut through the air, someone who had fought in America's bloodiest war and written home with words meant for family, not for cameras. The chamber shifted again. Listeners leaned forward. The laughter had already started to sour in the room, and the question now hung in the air. Whose voice was she about to call into this fight? Because Crockett was about to prove that history itself was on her side. Tommy Tuberville didn't walk into politics as a statesman. He walked in with the swagger of a coach who thought every arena was his locker room, every debate just another halftime pep talk. For years, his public persona was built on winning football games and commanding sidelines, not on understanding sacrifice or governing with humility. And when he made the leap from sports to the Senate, he carried that same bravado into a chamber that demanded more than a playbook of cliches. On paper, he marketed himself as a patriot. He draped himself in the language of faith, freedom, and loyalty to the troops. His speeches were salted with references to our men and women in uniform, and his campaign ads flashed images of soldiers saluting against sunsets. But behind the sound bites, his record told another story. Tuberville built a reputation for blocking critical military appointments, holding hostage the careers of men and women who had given their lives to the service of this country. He claimed it was about principles, but the real effect was gridlock left waiting, units left leaderless, military readiness weakened, and morale eroded. To critics, it was hypocrisy at its sharpest edge, a man shouting about love for the troops while playing politics with their futures. And yet, when confronted, Tuberville didn't bend. He laughed, he mocked, he treated his critics like annoying hecklers in the stands, as though the gravity of military sacrifice could be waved off with a grin and a shrug. That laugh became his trademark. It was the sound of someone who had never risked more than a scoreboard, treating sacrifice like a prop. Veterans noticed. Families noticed, and still, he smirked. There were moments that defined this arrogance. When asked about basic facts of American history, Tuberville stumbled, exposing a lack of knowledge that would have humbled another man. Instead, he doubled down, brushing off corrections, pretending mistakes didn't matter. When confronted about his blanket blockade of military promotions, he waved away the human cost, claiming that if generals and admirals wanted promotions badly enough, they could wait. That dismissal, that smug indifference, was the soil from which this chamber confrontation grew. Tuberville wasn't just a man with controversial opinions, he was a figure who had turned arrogance into a governing style. The arrogance of assuming that mocking a daughter of a veteran would go unnoticed, the arrogance of believing his laugh was the final word. But arrogance has a way of setting the stage for its own collapse, because every sneer, every smirk, every laugh made his eventual silence more dramatic. The higher the villain climbs on his own ego, the harder the fall when dignity pulls the rug out from under him. Tuberville thought Crockett was just another young lawmaker he could dismiss, another moment he could wave off with a chuckle. What he didn't know was that Crockett carried more than her own story, she carried her father's, and by extension, the stories of countless soldiers who had been disrespected by men who never knew the weight of a rifle or the fear of not making it home. That day, Tuberville wasn't just representing himself. He was standing as a symbol of every politician who speaks of patriotism while undermining it, every leader who claims to honor veterans while treating them as bargaining chips. His laugh didn't just echo in the chamber, it echoed across living rooms, across social media, across the families of veterans who recognized that smirk all too well. And yet, arrogance always blinds itself. Tuberville had no idea the storm that was coming. He didn't see Crockett's composure as a warning. He didn't notice the way her calm cut sharper than his mockery. He had no clue that buried in the folder resting before her was something no laugh could overcome, because arrogance never anticipates dignity's revenge. And Tuberville's laughter that day would soon transform into something no one expected: silence. Jasmine Crockett didn't arrive in Congress by accident. She wasn't born into wealth or legacy, and she didn't inherit her seat like a family heirloom. She earned it, brick by brick, through a lifetime of resilience, sacrifice, and the unshakable lessons she learned from her father, the man who once carried a rifle through the sweltering jungles of Vietnam and rode home with words heavy enough to outlast decades. Her story begins in a working-class household where ambition wasn't a luxury but a necessity. Crockett grew up hearing the echoes of a father who had seen war firsthand and a mother who carried the weight of keeping the family grounded while he was gone. The Crockett household wasn't filled with privilege, it was filled with stories some told aloud. Others only hinted at about the price of wearing an American uniform while being treated as second class at home. From a young age, Jasmine understood contradiction. She saw how her father was honored in uniform abroad, yet overlooked as a black veteran in his own country. She watched him navigate the sharp edges of racism and indifference, carrying scars not just on his body, but in his memory. Those scars weren't spoken of in dramatic terms. They were revealed in quiet pauses, in the way his eyes would drift. When asked about the war, in the letters folded carefully away but never forgotten, that's the soil Jasmine grew from. Her education wasn't just classrooms and textbooks, it was absorbing the lesson that dignity isn't given, it's demanded. She learned that when someone laughs at you, mocks you, or tries to dismiss you, the most powerful response is not to shout louder, but to stand taller. As she built her career, first as an attorney defending the rights of the voiceless, and then as a representative, Crockett carried her father's lessons like armor. She was no stranger to being underestimated. In courtrooms, older men tried to talk over her. In politics, establishment figures doubted her. Each time, she responded not with anger but with precision, turning their dismissal into fuel. But nothing defined her more than the letters. Her father's Vietnam letters, ink smudged by sweat and rain, written under the dim light of makeshift camps, carried the essence of who he was. They weren't polished speeches or carefully crafted statements. They were raw, unfiltered testimonies of fear, love, and survival. Words to his family, words that spoke of missing home, of longing for peace. of holding on to dignity in a place designed to strip it away. Jasmine knew the weight of those letters. He had read them in quiet moments, sometimes aloud, sometimes to herself, always with a reverence that bordered on sacred. They were a reminder that her father's service was not just history, it was living proof that sacrifice demands respect. And so, when she walked into that chamber on the day Tuberville laughed, she wasn't alone. She carried those letters like invisible allies, each word a reminder that history was watching. She didn't see herself as a single lawmaker locked in a battle of personalities. She saw herself as a vessel for voices long silenced, a representative, not just of her district but of every veteran who had written words that were never read in rooms of power. That's why she didn't flinch when Tuberville laughed. She didn't break stride, didn't let his smirk rattle her cadence. She had faced worse dismissal in classrooms, condescension in courtrooms, systemic barriers that tried to box her out before she even began. His laugh was nothing new. What was new was the platform, the chance to show America that dignity outlasts mockery. And in that folder on her desk, tucked between policy papers, rested a piece of her father's heart. A letter that had survived humidity, dirt, and the constant threat of death. A letter that wasn't meant for public eyes, but spoke truths more powerful than any Senate speech. That day, Crockett didn't just represent her father. She represented every immigrant soldier who fought for a country that doubted their belonging. Every black veteran who returned home to find segregation stronger than the medals pinned to their chest. Every family who had tucked away letters and telegrams as their only link to loved ones overseas. Her calm composure in that chamber was built on all of that. Her silence in the face of Tuberville's laugh wasn't weakness. It was the silence of someone waiting for the perfect moment to unleash history. And when the moment came, it wouldn't be Crockett who spoke first. It would be her father. And in her folder, she carried proof words inked decades earlier in the jungles of Vietnam. The air in the chamber was already tight, but as the exchange dragged on, it thickened into something almost unbearable. Tuberville leaned forward, emboldened by his own smirk, tossing interruptions under his breath, each one punctuated with that same grating laugh. To him, this was sport. To Crockett, it was ceremony. The difference between mockery and memory had never been starker. She straightened her papers, not rushing, not flustered. Every move was deliberate, and that composure only seemed to irritate him more. He wanted her rattled. He wanted her voice to crack. Instead, her stillness became the spotlight, throwing his antics into harsher relief. Around them, the chamber noticed some staffers pretended to shuffle documents, trying to mask their discomfort. Others shot sideways glances at one another, silently acknowledging the tension without daring to break it. The sound of Tuberville's chuckle carried like an off-key note in an otherwise solemn song. It was the sound of disrespect amplified by marble walls and microphones. Crockett kept speaking, threading her points carefully. She referenced not just policies, but principles, grounding every sentence in something larger than herself. The more Tuberville mocked, the more it became clear that this wasn't a clash of equals. It was a collision between arrogance and dignity. Viewers at home could feel it too. The livestream comments ticked upward, some seething with outrage, others pleading for Crockett to deliver the blow they knew she was holding back. On social media, the clip of Tuberville laughing had already begun to circulate, captioned with outrage emojis and incredulous commentary. But in the chamber itself, everything slowed. The audience caught between frustration and anticipation. Crockett paused, finally, setting her notes down with precision. She looked across the chamber, not at Tuberville directly, but just past him, as though his laughter wasn't even worth the dignity of her gaze. That silence was louder than anything she had said yet. Even Tuberville's grin faltered for half a second, unsure whether she had finished or was only beginning. When she spoke again, her tone carried a new weight, measured, firm, but with an undercurrent that made ears prick up. She wasn't defending herself anymore. She was preparing the ground for something greater. The chamber leaned in. The laugh that had filled the room only minutes before now felt out of place, grotesque in hindsight. Tuberville shifted in his seat, suddenly less comfortable, though his smile remained plastered on like armor he couldn't afford to shed. And then Crockett reached for her folder, slowly, calmly, no theatrics, no sudden movements, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew the next moment would be remembered long after the camera stopped rolling. A few papers shuffled aside, the faint sound echoing in the otherwise still room. She pulled free a single page worn at the edges, creased with time, its words penned decades earlier in ink that had survived war. The audience couldn't see what it was yet, but they could sense it. Something sacred had been brought into the room. A ripple of awareness passed through the chamber like a chill. This wasn't just another statistic, another political argument. This was history itself, waiting to speak. Tuberville laughed one last time, softer now, uncertain. The grin remained, but the confidence behind it wavered. He had no idea what was about to hit him, because Crockett was no longer debating. She was about to bear witness. And then, Crockett unfolded a letter that had survived mud, blood, and time. The room stilled as Jasmine Crockett unfolded the page, her fingers careful, reverent, as though she were holding more than paper. She wasn't just opening a document. She was opening a portal to another time, another battlefield, another truth. The chamber seemed to shrink around her, marble and wood fading into the background, until it was just her, the letter, and the weight of history pressing down. Her voice was calm when she began. No theatrics, no shouting, just a steady cadence that carried farther than any raised volume could. "This is a letter," she said, "written in 1969. My father wrote it from a tent in Vietnam, after losing 2 of his closest friends in a single night." The silence was immediate, thick, as if every ear strained to catch the words. Even Tuberville's grin faltered. His laugh had evaporated, leaving behind an awkward stillness on his face, as though he didn't know what to do with it now. Crockett began to read. "Dear family," she said softly, "tonight I don't know if I will see the sunrise. The gunfire hasn't stopped. The jungle feels alive with shadows. I miss home. I miss Mama's cooking. I miss the sound of quiet. But if I don't come home, please remember that I believed in what I was doing. Please tell Jasmine, when she is old enough, that her daddy fought not for glory, but because he believed dignity was worth something." The words hung in the air like smoke. A ripple moved across the chamber. One aide lowered his head. Another wiped at his eyes, trying to be discreet. Tuberville's smirk collapsed into something unreadable, a tightness in the jaw, a sudden fascination with the papers in front of him. Crockett paused, letting the silence deepen, then continued. "They told us this fight would bring freedom. I don't know if that's true, but I do know this. Freedom means nothing if it doesn't reach every man, every woman, every child, no matter their skin color, no matter where they were born. If I don't return, tell Jasmine she must stand tall. She must remind this country what sacrifice looks like." The impact was undeniable. You could almost hear hearts beating faster. Crockett's voice didn't waver. She wasn't pleading for sympathy. She wasn't begging for respect. She was channeling a voice from half a century ago, a voice that refused to be mocked. Tuberville shifted again, trying to settle into his chair, but the room had turned against him. Every laugh, every smirk he had offered earlier was now painted. In stark contrast to the raw humanity echoing through Crockett's words, his silence was louder than his laughter had been. Crockett lowered the page for a moment, her eyes sweeping the room. "My father came home," she said, "but too many didn't, and those who did return carried wounds that no one could see. They carried memories, they carried letters, and too often, they carried the knowledge that politicians would exploit their sacrifice while mocking their families." She let that sentence land. The pause afterward felt electric. The chamber, holding its breath. Tuberville's name wasn't spoken, but everyone knew who she meant. She raised the page again and finished the letter. "So if I don't make it back, tell Jasmine this. Never let anyone laugh at your dignity. Never let anyone strip you of your worth. Stand firm, stand proud, because dignity, once surrendered, is never returned." The final line struck like a hammer. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The chamber was frozen, the words still ringing in the air. Crockett folded the letter slowly, carefully, as though sealing it back into its sacred place. She didn't raise her voice, didn't gloat. She simply looked forward, her composure unshaken, her calm presence now carrying the weight of generations, and in that silence Tuberville's arrogance cracked. The man who had laughed minutes earlier now sat speechless, his mockery swallowed by the undeniable gravity of sacrifice. His grin was gone, his shoulders stiff. For the first time that day, he looked small. The room began to stir, not with noise, but with the subtle shift of energy that comes when a tide turns. Phones buzzed, staffers whispered, aides scribbled notes. The moment was already being etched into history, not because Crockett had shouted, not because she had humiliated him with insults, but because she had done the one thing arrogance cannot withstand. She had reminded everyone of dignity. Social media lit up almost instantly. Clips of her reading the letter went viral within minutes. Hashtags emerged. Veterans posted their own stories. Families of service members wrote about the letters tucked away in their attics. Crockett's.com defiance became a rallying cry. But in that chamber, at that exact moment, all anyone could see was Tuberville, silent and stone-faced, finally stripped of the only weapon he had ever wielded. The laughter was gone, but the shock waves were just beginning. The silence in the chamber didn't stay contained. It spilled outward, into corridors, into offices, into the bloodstream of a country wired to react in real time. By the time Crockett had folded the letter and returned it to her folder, the clip was already looping across social media feeds. What had begun as a chuckle from Tuberville had now ignited a storm that no strategist could spin away. On Twitter, hashtags blazed. Hashtag letter from Vietnam, hashtag dignity over mockery, hashtag Crockett strong. Veterans shared their own fragments of letters, eloed pages. Ink faded but words intact, each one echoing the sentiment her father had written decades earlier. "This is what service looks like," one user posted alongside a photo of her father's correspondence from Iraq, not Tuberville's smug grin. TikTok stitched the moment endlessly. One creator overlaid Tuberville's laughter on a loop, then cut to Crockett reading the letter, the contrast as sharp as a blade. Others added swelling music, slowing down her delivery to emphasize each line. The younger generation, many of whom had parents or grandparents who served, flooded the comments with stories. My dad wrote letters from Desert Storm. Same pain, same hope. My grandpa never made it back from Korea. This hit different. News outlets scrambled. Clips ran on cable news with commentators replaying Tuberville's smirk in slow motion, juxtaposed against Crockett's steady voice. Analysts spoke of optics, of tone, of the moment, dignity defeated arrogance on live television. But beneath the punditry, the raw human truth carried more weight. People recognized themselves in her story. Celebrities added their voices. Actors, musicians, and athletes with military families reposted the video with captions like "This is leadership and respect is not optional." Even political opponents who rarely praised Crockett publicly admitted she had delivered something unforgettable. And then came the veterans themselves. From every branch, every background, they posted videos holding their own letters, medals, photographs. Some cried openly on camera. Others simply stared into the lens and said, "We know what that letter means. We lived it." Tuberville's silence became its own meme. Screenshots of his expression caught between arrogance and realization spread with captions like, "When history speaks louder than your laugh," and the face of a man who underestimated dignity. For once, his trademark smirk wasn't his armor, it was his undoing. But beyond the humor, beyond the memes, something deeper was happening. Crockett's moment didn't just trend. It tapped into a reservoir of collective memory. Families who had tucked away their loved ones. Letters pulled them back out, rereading lines written decades ago. Parents showed their children what war correspondence looked like, explaining that service wasn't about slogans, but about survival. In community centers, churches, and VFW halls, the clip played on loop. Veterans nodded solemnly, some wiping their eyes, others shaking their heads at the thought of a senator daring to laugh at the daughter of a man who had written such words. For Tuberville, the fallout was immediate. His office tried to spin the moment, releasing statements about misunderstood context. But no press release could drown out the raw footage of his chuckle. No explanation could erase the sight of him smirking while Crockett held the words of a man who once faced death for his country. The contrast was immortalized, and once immortalized, it was unstoppable. For Crockett, the ripple effect was the opposite. She didn't need to boast. She didn't need to campaign. The moment spoke for her. She had become the vessel of something larger than politics, a reminder of what respect truly meant. The country had witnessed more than a debate. They had witnessed a clash of archetypes, mockery versus dignity, arrogance versus sacrifice, and they had chosen a side. The numbers of views, the trending hashtags, the millions of shares were not just digital noise. They were validation. They were proof that America still responded when truth cut through the static. And yet, as powerful as the viral moment became, its deepest resonance wasn't online. It was in the quiet corners, where families reread their own letters, where veterans remembered their own battles, where dignity was quietly restored in households that had too often felt forgotten. Because in the end, Crockett's words weren't just for the chamber. They were for every kitchen table where a folded letter still rests. And yet, the true power of that letter wasn't just online, it was in what it reminded America of. When the noise of trending hashtags faded, when the clips stopped looping endlessly across timelines, what lingered was not the laughter, nor even the silence that followed. What lingered was the lesson. Jasmine Crockett had not entered that chamber to humiliate a senator. She had entered to remind the country of something we too often forget. Sacrifice is not a slogan. It is a promise paid in blood, ink, and silence. Her father's words, pulled from a jungle half a century ago, reverberated across time to expose the emptiness of arrogance. Tuberville's chuckle, once so sure of itself, now stood as a monument to the dangers of forgetting. His smirk represented the ease with which politicians drape themselves in patriotism while mocking the very families who bear its cost. But Crockett's.com/her unwavering dignity reframed the moment into something larger than one confrontation. She turned his laugh into a lesson. She showed that when arrogance tries to belittle sacrifice, the answer is not fury, it is memory. She proved that truth spoken calmly, anchored in history, can silence even the loudest mockery. And so, the chamber didn't just witness a debate. It witnessed a parable, that dignity outlives derision, that respect cannot be laughed away, that America is strongest when it honors the quiet courage of those who gave more than politicians ever will. For viewers, the message was clear. This wasn't about one senator and one representative. It was about every father who rode home from war, every mother who prayed through the night, every child who grew up waiting by the mailbox. Crockett had carried their voices into the chamber, and for a moment, America had listened. And that's what gave the scene its lasting power. Not the silence of Tuberville, but the resonance of her father's letter. His words reminded the nation that laughter fades, but sacrifice lasts. His letter, once meant only for family, had become a mirror for the country, forcing us to look at ourselves, to ask whether we still deserve the sacrifices made in our name. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to say it outright. Her composure said it for her. America must be better than its arrogance. We owe that to every soldier, every family, every folded flag resting on a mantle. And that is why this moment will not vanish with the next news cycle. It will remain, replayed in classrooms, cited in speeches, remembered in quiet conversations at kitchen tables. A daughter, carrying her father's words, silenced a laugh and reminded a nation of its soul. And that's why this moment will be remembered long after the cameras turned off. The chamber eventually moved on, but the echo of that letter has not. It lives now in the hearts of those who watched, in the families who pulled their own folded pages out of shoeboxes and drawers, in the veterans who finally felt seen. Tommy Tuberville's laughter may have opened the moment, but it was Jasmine Crockett's composer and her father's words that closed it with finality. This story is not about one senator's arrogance. It's not even just about one representative's resilience. It is about what America chooses to honor. Do we celebrate the smirk of entitlement, or do we lift up the quiet dignity of sacrifice? Crockett's answer was clear. Her father's answer was clearer. And now, the question belongs to us. Because this moment is bigger than politics. It is about memory, about respect, about what we pass down. A laugh fades in seconds. A letter endures for generations. And in that truth lies the reminder that dignity is not optionally, is the foundation of who we are. If you felt the power of that letter, if you believe in honoring the people who gave this country more than it ever gave them back, then share this story. Tell it to your family. Post it, carry it forward. Because moments like these are not meant to be forgotten, they are meant to ripple. And if you want more stories where arrogance is unmasked and dignity is vindicated, then subscribe. Join this community. Be part of the voices who refuse to let mockery drown out sacrifice. Together, we can make sure letters like Jasmine Crockett's father's are not relics of the past, but living reminders of the America we still have the power to become.